If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, people who've experienced the paranormal or seen cryptids and other unknown creatures, what's your story? As an officer on a reservation, we kept getting reports of a tall man at different places in a town on our reservation. One night we was able to catch him on a thermal camera. There was about 8 to 10 officers there. It was on a hill overlooking the town that was right below. After my father passed away, I went to live with my friend and his mom for a little while. Things with my mom were very strained and I didn't want to stay at my friend's house initially. But they didn't want me alone during that time. Staying at anyone's house always made me feel uneasy for some reason. My first night there, early in the morning I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door opening and a gentleman wearing a red flannel and bib denim overalls came into my room holding a bag of tools. He turned the light on, looked at me and walked through another doorway to the utility room. Soon after, I fell asleep again. But when I woke up this time, room was dark. Everything was the same when I went to sleep the night previously. Figuring I imagined the whole thing, I went upstairs for coffee and asked my friend's mom if the guy with the overalls is still here. With a weird look, she informed me that it's been her and I in the house all night. At this point, I'm very confused. So I explained in detail about what the man looked like. Height, weight, clothes, facial hair. Everything. She turns pale white and bolts to her room and retrieves a photo. When she shows me the photo, it's the man I saw in the basement that morning. Even wearing the same clothes. She tells me that he passed away 30 years ago. It was her grandpa who owned the property previously. He had killed himself to save the farm when he invested his money into horses instead of machines and his investment flopped. To keep the bank from taking the farm. On a stormy night he took a lightning rod into the middle of a pond and nature took his life when lightning struck the rod. Because of this, life insurance paid out, and his suicide saved the family diary and kept the house from being foreclosed on. My dad had shit going on in his house, so much shit that almost every kid who would come in, myself, my sisters, my brother and my dad have all had multiple experiences in there. I remember one time, I was going upstairs to have a shower. The bathroom was the end of the hallway and on the way to it, I had to pass by the room I shared with my sisters when I was over for the weekends. As I passed by, I seen something sit up on the bottom bunk. We had bunk beds in there, out of the corner of my eye. This thing looked like a little girl. She had pale skin, short black hair that was cut in a bob style with straight bangs covering her forehead, and her eyes were these massive circles with large black dots in the center for pupils. She was facing sideways so her right shoulder was facing me when she turned her head, the other half of her body looked like it was under the blankets. I remember getting such an intense feeling of fear that I went back downstairs and refused to go upstairs at all or even sleep in the house. My dad had to set up the camping tent in the backyard for the rest of the weekend. If this occurrence had been nothing / me just seeing things that weren't there, I feel like I shouldn't still remember it in perfect detail at the age I am now, seen it when I was maybe 6 or so. I'm 23 now. When I was about 14 my family had just moved to a house in the suburbs where there was a lot of open space and the house had a huge backyard. One night about 2200 hours I opened our sliding door to take out the trash and I saw 2 figures walking towards the house. The best way I could describe them is they were all black, slim, almost looked and moved like kangaroos, but I was living in New Jersey and they don't exist in that area. Also they were walking 4-footed, but when I opened the door and turned on the light they stood up on 2 feet and began to run. Now I turned and shut the door before I completely saw them run, but I got a good enough glance to know this wasn't any regular animal like a deer. And besides there was never any deer in that neighborhood, so this was definitely something different. Still creeps me out over 15 years ago. Working on ships, some are pretty old and you hear some weird stories. 4 years ago during a South American season, I used to hang out with the Brazilians, fun and cool people. One was the gift shop manager. He'd rant and rant about how his team is lazy and how they keep trying to weasel out of working because they claim to see a little girl running around the gift shop. One night, we were having coffee with the head of the photography department and he's extra salty, talking about how he'll have to do an extra couple of hours because of his team. In the middle of the night, I get a call from the photo manager. She tells me our friend is in her cabin crying and shivering. I run over, thinking he got some bad news from home or something. Turns out he was working in his office. The door faces a long mirror that covers most of the wall, closed section, and after hearing giggling, he saw the shadow of a child through the reflection, as if she was leaning to look into the door while trying to hide, only in the reflection. He says he jumped up and ran out, the giggling and sounds of tiny feet running around the shop and into the casino, same deck. I'm not big into the paranormal, But the following day I mentioned this to my boss and she told me that about 20 years back, a little girl came out of the theater with her parents. She was running ahead of them, around the gift shop, but eventually she went into the casino, coming out at the atrium, a drop with glass lifts that go from deck 12 to 5, so a good drop. She leaned over the railing to look down, lost her balance and fell, breaking her neck on impact and dying. Apparently it was a common sighting at the shop and casino. I was working at a summer camp in the PNW one year. On the second or third night there, I was jogging alone back from the staff campfire to the cabin, where the campers and my co-counselor slept. I'm walking in this big grassy throughway that has some taller reeds separating it from a shore of the Puget Sound. It's probably 2 a.m? Full moon. As I'm jogging I see this person in the reeds. It's wearing a white gown, and it has no face, just hair. I only notice it because, as I approached it, it stood up from a crouched position, backed up joltily a few steps, then crouched down again, but I could still see it crouching there, like it was waiting. Its movements told me that it was not human. My knees gave out, and I felt flooded with fear as I collapsed. I tried to run back to my cabin but my legs would not work. I crawled and scrambled there on all fours. I tried to scream but no sound came out. Just gasping. I finally got to my cabin and fumbled with the doorknob for what felt like a minute before I could open it. I closed the door and stood there waiting for a while inside. I didn't hear anything, but I barely slept. At some point later that night I remember laughing, thinking it was just one of the campers peeing. I was hysterically laughing at myself for like 20 minutes, then fell asleep. Next morning though, I realized that no campers returned to the cabin that could have potentially been out there peeing that night. I asked all of them, and all of them said they hadn't gone out to pee the previous night. I'll add that this was a camp that was overtly for non-religious, skeptically minded staff and campers, of which I was and still largely am, but I have no explanation for what I saw that night. Still scares the shit out of me just typing this. Several years ago, some friends and I were driving through one of the millions of small towns around the North/South Carolina border in the mountains. It was well after midnight. My friend looks behind us, and sees a pair of headlights coming up on us. Quickly. Like, easily 60 to 70 miles per hour when the limit is 25 or so. No signs of stopping, so my friend pulls over to let the car past. And what passes us is two lights. Just lights. Far too bright to be a firefly or any luminescent creature. As bright as headlights, if not brighter. Not attached to anything. No car, nothing. Just two lights booking it down the road. My dad worked as a truck driver for CR England, and during the summer when I didn't have school, I'd go on the truck with him and drive all around America. I lived in Utah, so I got to see him regularly since I guess that's where the main headquarters are or something. He hasn't worked there since I was 12 and I was 10 at the time. We were driving along the dark rural roads up in northern Montana after just dropping off a shipment to Washington. I remember me and my dad drinking Rockstar while listening to Neil Diamond on his iPod. I never got to stay up with my mom, so being with him and trying to stay up was really an enjoyment. All of a sudden we saw a big ape-like hairy creature running across the streets on two legs. We would have assumed it was an ape if it wasn't walking on two legs and his head reached to the ducking windshield. We almost barely hit it and my dad had to stop himself from slamming on his brakes. But I do remember him quickly looking back at me then in his mirrors. We both just confirmed that we may have just saw Bigfoot, but we aren't really sure since we couldn't really stop or turn back. I remember this night so clearly because I asked my dad why he didn't just slam on his brakes, and he told me that because he was carrying a large trailer in the back, he can't just slam on his brakes without causing a much bigger accident. My grandmother was a Cajun voodoo black witch, dark shit, animal sacrifices, bloodletting, and the like. We were all convinced she had a place waiting for her in hell. She was not a big woman. She was maybe 5 foot tall, 100 pounds. At her funeral, they had 4 men carry her casket from the funeral home to the hearse. At the church, it took 6 to get her out. It took 8 to get her into the cemetery, as she got heavier and heavier as they got closer to her grave. 10 men to get her to her actual grave. When we returned to her house, where the rest of the family was, me and my uncle went to the kitchen, and the kitchen was hot, like opening an oven hot, and it was mid-February at the time, in a house in the country with no electricity. Inside the kitchen, we both saw my grandma, whom we just buried, holding hands with 4 other women. I didn't know them at all, but my uncle knew a couple. One was his grandma's sister, who died, one was grandma's mom, who was long dead, but not all. We left. Have not been back in that house since. That was close to 30 years ago. I often get sleep paralysis and I'm used to it now, but the first time I experienced it, it was pretty terrifying. I dreamed that I was in an arena and all my family and friends were in the stands calling out to me. About 10 feet away there was a creature running straight at me. It looked like a very emaciated man, just skin and bones, but his mouth was filled with sharp teeth that almost looked like razors. I couldn't really move, you know how dreams can be, and he grabbed my hand and put it in his mouth and bit down. I felt the most excruciating pain and then woke up. I switched on my bedside lamp and my hand was all red where he had bitten me. I was pretty freaked out and I got up to use the restroom and try to calm down when I saw my roommate leave his room. I called out to him and said, "Man, I just had the most awful dream." He looked kinda shocked and said, "Me too," so I asked him what he dreamed and he told me almost word for word what I had dreamed. The only difference was the creature didn't bite him but scratched him across his stomach. Then he raised up his shirt and I saw 3 scratch marks across his belly. I then told him my dream and we both were pretty freaked out for a while. Ever since that day I've had regular sleep paralysis and that creature always shows up while I'm paralyzed. I know this is the internet and people make up all kinds of stuff. But I'm telling the truth. It was the single scariest moment of my life. Grew up in Ass Deep, Louisiana. I could be here all night. The most memorable one I have, and I know it'll sound like bullshit, is the Rougarou/Dogman thing that used to sit in the clearing past our driveway. I used to sneak out of the house and smoke at night and stay up late, standard rebel emo teenager shit, and we lived in the middle of a highway. No towns or nothing for miles both ways. Our only light was a massive searchlight past our garage, and being on a huge property meant just about anything from coyotes to panthers could roll out of the woods like it was nothing. But I was used to it. What I wasn't used to was the thing that would sit out in the clearing time to time, especially in the winter. It'd just sit under the searchlight the way one does when you sit on the ground with your legs straight out, holding its tail and picking at the ground. At first I thought we just had wolves or coyotes on roids, but eventually I made stupid white man in a horror film decision to step out and whistle at it. Maybe it was a stray dog. I learned my lesson when it scrambled to its bipedal feet and stared straight at me, before hopping the chain link and running out onto the deserted highway. It came back every few weeks or so in the early morning/late night, usually sitting in that clearing digging at the crawfish holes or squatting at the end of the gravel driveway. I'd say duck it and just go smoke in our laundry room those nights. I used to have photos of the torn apart crawfish mounds, but I haven't had that phone since 2013. I moved away years later, and I often wonder if it's still there. It wouldn't surprise me. The property was haunted, or at least had bodies buried on it. The headstones behind the barn always freaked me the duck out. But not as much as the Rougarou. I still have dreams about the way it stared at me. Nobody I ever told believed me, but my dog and I know what we saw night after night. When I was 17 I was at my friend's apartment building, which his parents owned. It was a pretty old building in the Pilsen neighborhood of Chicago, and according to his dad it used to be owned by Al Capone, but I'm not sure how true that was. We had an apartment on the top floor that they let us use to just hang out and it allowed us easy access to the attic. It had a lock on the door but we had a key, so we could go out to the roof and smoke cigarettes. One night, we were about to go up, but I had to pee, so I told him I'd meet him up there. After I was done, I went up the stairs to the attic portion that was connected to the roof. There were no lights, so we always used our phones to guide us. We had those old flip phones without lights, so you only had the light from the screen to help navigate the cluttered mess that was up there. As I made my way to the roof door, I saw a shadow pass by me. Now this wasn't like the shadow of something moving with the light of my phone, this shadow felt solid like a person. I followed the direction it went thinking it was my friend. I kept saying that I knew it was him and to stop playing around. It passed me a few more times, before heading to the other side of the attic, and that's when I heard my friend's voice from downstairs. He got a call from his girlfriend and was in another room talking to her the whole time. It really freaked me out, since I know I was following something, so I basically jumped down the stairs. I told my friend what happened and that I did not want to go back up there and he agreed, so we decided to go for a walk instead. Last year his brother tells us in our group text that he found out the building's designer killed himself in that attic. My boyfriend's sister's boyfriend, Fr. Lowell, told us his Sasquatch encounter story. First he described how there was a time he whistled and a whistle was returned back to him from the woods by his house. He didn't know what it was calling back to him, but as he continued something about it unnerved him. He said something about a second time where he or someone he knew heard running after the whistling, but it was heavy and traveled faster than a human could. So basically him and his buddies know about strange activity but don't know what it is. Some months later and a piece of land is clear-cut, close to his house, connected to those woods. Trigger warning, that winter he let his cat outside, into the snow. He knows this cat and it is commonly outdoors, it always comes back. I forget exactly what made him worried, but he goes out looking for the cat sometime later. Hess out looking with his sister and dog. As Hess looking, he crests a hill, and just before the top, he hears the loudest booming scream directed at him. Him and his dog run back down the hill, back to his sister, and she asks what the hell that was. They flee back to the house together, and there they find his cat, tossed on a ledge, neck broken and frozen. There were no footprints around it, and it was not immediately recent. He described how he could still hear the distant booming. He says he believes it was angered by the clear cutting, and associated him with it or something. His own story was much more detailed, and made more chronological sense, but I thought I'd share what I remember. Not sure how much I believe him, but I don't disbelieve him. So the year was 2010, and there was going to be a blood moon. So I rounded up a bunch of equipment to get a good picture of it. I love the moon, my favorite times have all happened under its pale light. Borrowed an awesome camera that could be attached to a telescope, had my laptop and various other equipment, but also strapped on my 40 calories pistol because there are mountain lions and coyotes in the area. Loaded all my gear into my Jeep and headed to an area a few miles away from town. Get to the place where I'm going to set up, begin unloading and setting everything up, and I hear some nearby sheep start freaking out. Didn't think much of it, and after a handful of minutes they went quiet again. Just as I was unloading the scope I hear a very loud splash. Basically the layout of the land was pasture creek where I was cornfield, and for some reason this caught my attention and I stood up and looked towards the creek for a second but don't hear anything else, so I went back to setting up the scope. Now I hear some rustling, twigs snapping, that sort of thing, and stand up and shine my flashlight around to see what I can see. Don't see anything, and whatever it was went quiet when I shined the light around, so I figured I'd scared it off and started screwing the scope onto the tripod when I heard a very loud snap and whipped back around, pulling my gun and shining my light towards a fallen tree I'd noticed earlier. And there it was, roughly the size of a bear, but the head was more canid than ursid, and the body was more lean. We stood there staring at each other for what felt like forever, then it growled and charged and I screamed and fired my gun repeatedly. After the fact I found I'd fired 8 shots. It bowled me over and I fully expected that my life was over, but instead of following through with the attack it just kept running and disappeared into the cornfield. Thoroughly spooked, I tossed the most expensive bits I'd unpacked back into the Jeep and left immediately, only going back once the sun was fully up to finish recollecting my gear. When I got there I found a game warden, couple sheriff's deputies, and the farmer that owned the field/pasture. Apparently whatever it was had killed a couple sheep, and they were trying to figure out what it was and where it went. The tracks were both canid but also not canid, they were strangely longer than a standard dog print. What was it? Well, I'm still not sure, and sometimes it still keeps me up at night. Some have suggested it was a Dogman, but I'm not sure I believe in such things. My grandfather told me this story when I was staying at his place a couple of years ago. I don't remember how it came up exactly, but I think it fits this thread well. It was so odd and out of the blue, and I was so taken aback that I wrote down all the details that I could remember after the fact, so this isn't a word-for-word transcription, but it'll suffice. Anyways, back in the 1960s, my grandfather on my dad's side was drafted into the army for the Vietnam War. He gets discharged in late 1972, and drifts apart from all of his war buddies, except for one. They live remarkably close to one another in Washington state, and both exhibit some serious post-war PTSD issues. Therefore, they both decide to go on a hunting trip together, in around the autumn season of 1973, to try to find healing or closure post-war. As he tells it, he would always hunt deer in the woods behind his house. In those days, his home was more of a cabin, with basic necessities. It's probably late afternoon in rural Washington state. Anyone who's been in the Pacific Northwest forest knows how thick and dense the foliage and trees are. Not to mention the fog. You can't see far ahead of you. Sight lines become blurred. Sounds around you become amplified. This sense of isolation causes your blood pressure to rise. So, my grandfather and his friend from Nam are both hunting off trail, tying bright markers on tree branches as they move through the underbrush, so they don't get lost. Suddenly, they hear a sound. It's the blaring sound of a train horn. It's so loud, it causes the two men to become disoriented. My grandfather recalls that he fell to his knees, hands on ear, screaming, feeling his throat moving air, yet not hearing it. This sound doesn't seem to have direction. The sound is all-encompassing. It's everywhere. The ground is shaking. And, like a bad cliché, as soon as it began, it stopped, dissipating in an instant. They both are kneeling there, stunned. Their ears are ringing so badly they can't hear their own voices. Their mouths move, but nothing happens. As the sun sets, they begin to head back, obviously spooked beyond belief. As their eardrums are shot, they scribble notes to each other on a notepad as they hike back to my grandfather's cabin. As they are heading back, they see something hanging behind a tree up ahead on the trail. Its outlines are blurred, but as it floats, the best way my grandpa described it to me, towards them it's revealed, it's themselves. It wasn't like looking in a mirror per se. Because it was a creature. My grandfather felt it. The thing was blurry and fuzzy, but my grandfather, in his early 30s at the time, said that he saw himself as an old man, white beard, frail, sunken eyes. He had to squint, but his facial features were the same. His war friend, however, had a bullet hole in his head. The figure then morphed into black. An eternal void. Death. The early evening pinkish-orange sun rays just ended when they reached this blackness. They panicked at this point, running backwards into the woods, screaming like mad men. As darkness fell, they decided to keep on going, refusing to camp out in those woods. When recounting this story for me, my grandfather, never overly religious, said, "Op, I don't know what in the hell that thing we saw was, but I know for sure. And I mean damn sure, that it wasn't from this earth. What still bothers me is that I never saw what it actually looked like. I thought after the fact that it might have been a manifestation of Satan, because it was evil. And I'll tell you, I saw true evil in people during the war. But that thing, Op, I don't know. It was something else. It was an evil ducking bastard, and if I would have gotten closer, well." He trailed off there, but his uncomfortable, haunted glance practically finished the rest. After sprinting for a few miles, their flashlights luckily illuminating their trail markers, they reached the cabin, the night sky completely moonless. They anxiously stayed in the cabin until sunrise, their loaded hunting rifles next to them at all times, the windows and doors locked, blinds all shut, no lights on. If that thing was still out there, their wooden door would have been a relatively fragile barrier. Their anxiety-filled pacing must have made the time slow to a crawl. At one point they broke down and began praying, neither man ever being raised religious. Remind you, these are two battle-hardened Vietnam veterans that both saw combat. They may have had PTSD, but for something to scare both of them to this degree, yeah, it bothers you, doesn't it? Personally, it makes my skin crawl. Yet, with this said, no other strange encounters or experiences happened that night, or ever again for my grandfather. He moved shortly thereafter to a different town in Washington and promptly met my grandmother. Refuses to this day, nearly 50 years later, to step foot into any forest. Sadly, my grandfather said that the thing he and his friends saw in the woods that night was a bad, accurate omen for their lives. My grandfather has been struggling with alcoholism his entire life. Even today, he has had a liver transplant, and still drinks daily. His friend, however, committed suicide in 1975. He couldn't handle his own personal demons. Perhaps if there had been proper mental health services back then, things would have turned out differently. So back in the early 2000s, right up near McCall, me 16 and my buddy Tyler 16 were up in the mountains pretty far from any sort of actual civilization. We were up camping with my family and I brought him along. After about day 2 or 3 days we had the bright idea to go out on a night exploration. Bad idea. Anyway, we didn't tell my parents and just left at about 2 o'clock in the morning. We were sleeping in a separate tent, so sneaking out was easy. We were probably about 20 to 30 minutes into our so-called night exploration and we were decently far from camp. Around this time I started to get an uneasy feeling. I told Tyler that we should probably head back because it was pretty cold and I didn't want to admit I was freaking out. He insisted that we go on and that I should stop being a baby. I agreed. After about 10 more minutes into our night exploration I shined my light into a little clearing of the trees. I thought I saw a tall dark figure with very long lanky legs, a strange shaped body, and no arms. I wasn't too sure what it was and told Tyler we should go a little closer. We did and found this large 12-ish foot tall thing staring right at us both from about 20 feet away. When I tell I have never run faster in my life, I mean it. And after the run back to camp my legs were torn apart and bloodied by all the dead branches and whatnot. We had to sleep in my parents' tent the rest of the trip. Probably way different than the kind you were expecting, probably not even paranormal, but strange, and something I'd love answers to if anyone had them. I swear my Taco Bell account is cursed. When I got my new phone about 2 years ago, I downloaded the app because I happen to like Taco Bell. I finally made an account for it, so I could save favorite items as I'm heavy on customization. The thing is, it'll offer to save customized items when I make them, but if I select yes it just doesn't work. It goes through the process, but they never show up in my favorites. They just go off into the void. Similarly, every time I make an order, I have to add a new card to do it with. Same information, but for some reason the payment never processes on the already saved version. I also can't remove payment methods, When I go into the payment section, the X to delete them is just grayed out. I've got a graveyard of payment methods to scroll past every time I order. I've tried updating the app, tried uninstalling and reinstalling it, but nothing changes. Back in September, I stopped getting the option to add sour cream to tacos. It just wasn't anywhere in the customization, and I looked. But when I went to the website through my laptop, it was still there. I decided to log in to my account on the website, so I could get my rewards, but for some reason none of the passwords I tried seemed to work. I figured I'd used something I'd forgotten, so I went through the forgot password process and never got the email to reset it. I tried twice, I checked my spam and junk folders, it just never showed up. So I decided fine, I'll change the password through the app. But the same thing. I never got the email. I got frustrated. I decided duck it, I'm making a new account. Starting from the ground up, duck the rewards, I'm tired of this taco hell. I use a different email address than the one linked to my first account. I go through the register process and I never get the confirmation email. I try again, 3 or 4 times. I use a third different email address. I search all through my inboxes. There's no goddamn email. I relegated myself to ordering as a guest through the website. I tried again a few days later. Another time, a month after. No emails. No changing my password. No new accounts. The sour cream came back a month and a half later, like it had never left. I've learned to accept that I have one Taco Bell account. I'll always have only one. One time when I was about 14, I was staying at my friend's house. He had bunk beds and I called the top. We went to sleep like normal, but in my dream I saw a hooded man standing in the doorway. He walked in and stood staring at the both of us in our beds. When he looked at me, I felt ice cold and sick to my stomach. There was an overwhelming sense of dread running through me. I didn't want to draw attention to myself by calling for help, so I stayed dead quiet. The hooded man came closer and leaned down toward my friend in the bottom bunk. I was scared for my friend but relieved that its attention wasn't on me. I remember feeling ashamed of my cowardice. There was an ungodly noise coming from the hooded figure. A low, deep rumbling that grew louder and louder until it hurt my ears. I remember hoping that it would wake my friend's parents, but at the same time felt that we were trapped and alone in here. The man continued to scream/rumble until a never-ending swarm of insects started flying out of his hood. They were flying all around the room. I remember them buzzing my face, but I was too afraid to move to swat them away. The bugs kept flying out and soon the room was filled with them. I don't remember what happened next, but I must have passed out. The next day we were talking about how we slept and my friend's dad asked if we had a good sleep. I replied that I had a nightmare and it scared the hell out of me. My friend spoke up and said he had a nightmare as well. This is where it gets weirder. My friend said that he dreamed that he had thousands of bugs crawling all over him. I explained my nightmare and it creeped us both the hell out. Luckily they moved house not long after because there was no way in hell that I was ever going to sleep in that house again. One night we were driving home from a campground in North Alabama where we'd been visiting family. The roads were dark and twisty. As I turned one corner, I saw a creature in the ditch in the flash of my headlights. It looked exactly like an albino Bengal tiger eating a deer carcass. It was so shocking that I didn't say anything, just clenched up and my heart was racing. I glanced over at my wife and she was gripping the armrests with white knuckles. Without prompting her with what I saw, I said, "Did you see that?" She nodded and said, "Was that an albino tiger eating a deer?" Strangely, or because I was so freaked out, we didn't turn around. I told myself it was some garbage bags or something, but the fact that my wife and I saw exactly the same thing and that I saw it raise its head with bloody jaws bothers me to this day. For the record, North Alabama has a regional cryptid called the Alabama White Thing, sometimes White Thang, which appears as a large white cat, a wolf the size of a horse, a shapeless white form, or a large white humanoid. So, I guess we saw the White Thang. Okay, so not really a cryptid, but I reckon I've seen something undocumented. My wife and I were driving along the highway in remote northern West Australia. We come around a corner from behind a hill and there's this massive bird in the middle of the highway ripping into a kangaroo. We slam on the brakes to avoid hitting it and it spreads its wings and flies away. This thing's wingspan was easily longer than our Corolla and the top of the bonnet was probably 2/3 the height of it standing on the road. It looked like a type of eagle. Now, a wedge-tail eagle is supposed to be the biggest flighted bird in the world. And I've seen wedge-tails, right up close and trained to do tricks. This thing was easily at least 4 times the size as that. It could easily lift off with a dog or small child. My friends and I went to a town that's ahead of a well-known place of shamans and wizardly stuff because one of our friends told us that his granny has a house there and we can visit it on spring break. So, cue a group of 8 city folks driving to this remote place that's on the edge of a jungle, 11 p.m. and all it's dark because it's a small town with no street lights, neither floodlights on the streets. We're all trying to sleep on 86 degrees with humidity over 80% and of course none of us can do that. Now, my friend, F was looking a tree outside the window of the room and keeps staring, then M, other friend notices him staring hard at the tree and asks him. M, hey F, what's going on? F, tell me something, still looking outside and pointing with his hand, do you see it? M, stares at the window and makes this some noise, I think I do. By that moment, I'm listening this and ask them the same, they both say the same thing and point to the window, trying not to be too obvious. So, I began to stare to the outside and there's this tree that had no leaves when we arrived in the morning that looks like it has a patch of leaves on top, there's it is, grabbing to the top, 2 bright red dots, full of fur or feathers, tall, probably 5 feet 9, and slim figure staring at us probably since the sun went down, not moving, not doing anything but staring at us. Another friend, S, sees us staring at the window and she turns to see what's going on. Now the 4 of us are all getting kinda nervous, but we begun to brush it off as we're all just imagining stuff and after probably an hour we get to sleep. Next morning, we woke up and there's nothing but the leafless tree. Feren's granny it's doing breakfast at the kitchen and ask us if we rested well, the other 4 say yeah and we say it was okay, but we think there was something watching us. To that the lady says yeah, the neighbors noticed all of you and sent it to try to hurt you all of us get this oh shit expression on our faces. The lady continues, I knew they would try to do something. It can't get inside the perimeter because I prepared something to get protection. They hate me because I bought this land, and they have been trying to hurt me. The 3 days we were on that house, that thing was always looking us at night, on other trees, standing still. We went there 2 years later, the thing wasn't there, but they did us sometime, but that's a story for another time. I have a lot of stories, but I'll talk about my camp. My family camp has been in my family for generations. It's on old Native American land with a burial site. We have found many things on the land from our ancestors. We have the leader of the tribe that will ride his horse across the top of our sand pit and watch over us. The best thing that ever happened to us would be one night as we were all asleep in our campers, something came to every camper and ran around them knocking on them. When we all came outside we realized the river was flooding really badly and we had to hightail it out of there. The next day after the rain stopped we went back to find our little bridge had floated downstream. We had to get some paddle boats from my aunt's house to cross the river and once we got back to camp we saw that it was all flooded up to the doors of the campers. If we had stayed there all night we would have been stuck there and our vehicles could have been ruined, but luckily something that night warned us ahead of time. Okay, so it's not exactly cryptid. I didn't see anything out of the ordinary. But I'm pretty sure I met a skinwalker. Pennsylvanian suburbs, late spring. It's way past evening and pitch black, the crickets are loud as hell, and my brother and I are chilling in our room with the window up. Of course, we have a screen window. Anyway, I get up to go to the bathroom. Mid-piss I hear my brother talking. The strangest thing is, I didn't hear my mom come down the hall. I finish up, come out of the bathroom into the hall, and peer into our room. My brother is up to the window talking to this random ducking dude. Now, our window faces the front of the house, but it's a corner room. To the left of it, is a rather short but dense forest. Our suburb is disconnected by avenues, and many in between have these patches of trees. The dude's rambling off some nonsense, I can't recall exactly, but he was looking for something or someone. Have you seen my ex? He keeps asking and asking and asking. My brother keeps telling him no over and over, even starts to raise his voice about it. Seeing no resolution out of this, my brother shuts the window. Just moments later, we hear our front door's knob rattle. Thank God we keep it locked after hours. With no way to enter, this random dude seems to just ducking disappear. I say that because we have a good view on the rest of the front yard, and we never saw him leave the porch after trying the handle. Being nosy, I peek out the front blinds. And nothing. How the duck did we not see this guy? I talked to my brother and asked what went on after I went, and he practically retells the whole thing. Except, apparently, this dude came from the crowded woods in the dead of night. We told my mom in the morning, and she played it off as a druggie. Considering other creepy stuff that happened in my time living here, like a random air raid siren, I'm more inclined to believe some cryptid shit. I'm pretty sure that dude was a skinwalker or something. One day my wife came home, we were living in an apartment in Midtown. It's about 10 p.m. and I was taking the trash to the dumpster in the alley behind my complex. The complex had only 6 two-story apartments, the front door of each facing south. We lived in number 5, and if you were to walk outside, once you open the door there's a little raised landing where you'd put a welcome mat, step off the landing, you're on a walkway, and you have to go either left or right because there's a very tall wooden fence separating the complex from the large house next door. So if you turn right and walk down past apartments number 4 to 1 you run into a gate, go through a gate, and you're now on one of the main streets in Midtown. If you were to turn left coming out of the apartment, you will pass apartment number 6, then the laundry room, and immediately into a wrought iron gate, and immediately on the other side is the dumpster. It's a very short distance from my door to the dumpster, and with nothing to obstruct your view, you can see from the dumpster all the way down the length of the walkway to the gate at the other end of the complex. The entire area is well lit, literally every unit would turn their front porch light on every night, and there is a street light right where the dumpster is, and one right on the other side of the street side gate. So it was easy to see my wife open the gate and head up the walkway towards our apartment. I waved at her and have no idea how she didn't see me, and I thought about yelling but didn't want to scare her or startle the neighbors. I was done emptying the garbage, so I just started walking the short distance to her. As I'm walking up, I see the door to our apartment open. Of course I figured she opened it, but it was dark so I didn't actually see her do it. Then she kind of leans in and I could hear her calling my name, but she would not walk into the apartment, our own apartment, so why not walk right in, right? Then, when I got behind her and said hi she became frantic, asking me how the duck did you do that, how did you get back outside? I explained I'd been at the dumpster emptying the trash, to which she interrupted me, said no, you opened the door for me and walked upstairs, I called after you and you turned your head and looked at me but didn't say anything and just kept walking, and then she started crying. I searched the apartment, found nothing. We moved about 6 months later to the house we're at now. One day shortly after we moved in, my wife thought she saw me walk past the windows that look into the backyard from the kitchen, but it wasn't me, and again she said it looked just like me, and that it walked all the way around the house before disappearing, and then she realized I was in the bedroom. Creepy stuff. When I was in high school I worked as a courtesy clerk at Albertsons. People were always telling me that they saw me somewhere in town when I wasn't there. One day when I got out of class at the end of school, I had to go straight to work. I wouldn't get home until just after 9 o'clock that night. So I walked in just after 9 o'clock and said hi people to my mom and my sisters. And they all looked confused. My mom asked me where I was coming from. I said I had been at work. My mom and my older sister both said, no you haven't. You came in hours ago, said hi people and went upstairs. I said, no I didn't, I hadn't been home since I left at 7 o'clock this morning. So we all 4 went upstairs to my room to see who came home. My door was closed. I usually leave it open. The light was on and the TV was on. Opened the door, no one there. But wait. It gets weirder. In high school we had a secondary school called the Skills Center. It was a place that had a collection of vocational classes you could take. For instance, I took TV broadcasting, web design and forestry. One day I was waiting for the bus to leave the Skills Center after my broadcasting class and a teacher I never met ran up to me and said, Zoshiba, you need to come back to class. I had never been in her class. But apparently I had been missing for the last few seasons. I tried to explain I wasn't in her class, but she did seem to know who I was. So she took me to the office. Thinking I was ditching. We go in and I tell the office clerk my name and she looks me up. Sure enough, there I am in broadcasting just like I said. But there I am, under my stepdad's last name in her class. I went by both names. It was a bit confusing but both names were relatively unique. So it's not like there would have been a random person that looks just like me in her class. It's just extremely unlikely. I had been in her class for the entire semester until I mysteriously stopped showing up. I had turned in work and everything. Even had my goddamn signature on it. One day this doppelganger simply stopped showing up. No one ever saw him again. One more from the hospital prison wing. So there's these 2 rooms, I'll say 123 and 234, and they share a wall. The hospital isn't that old, built in the 70s, and it's a small town county hospital. We don't take trauma cases, and when one does come in, it's only to stabilize them until Life Flight or EMS can transfer them to another facility. Deaths in room are usually older people and natural causes. The prison wing has been rolling for 8 years or so, and the prisoners who come in, if they die, it's natural causes. But this one room said, it's just weird. I'm agnostic atheist, but I can't deny the same thing keeps happening in 123 and especially 234. There's a kid. There's been several times, right before they pass, the inmate talks about a kid in the room. But it's the ones who are delirious before death. Also, there have been several mentally altered offenders, not drug-addled but actual mental status, who have talked about or completely lost their shit over the kid that was under their bed, or running around, and ducking with them. One guy became so violent we had to discharge him from the hospital and back to his unit, not solely over the kid, but it seemed like a part of the problem. Occasionally an inmate with full mental capacity would mention the TV in another room was so loud sometimes he could hear it, said it sounded like a kid show or something with kids talking. I kept my hallway quiet and made sure I couldn't hear the TVs in the hall. There's certainly arguments that can be made that word of mouth got back to the units about the kid's story, but neither officers nor nurses made a habit of telling stories to inmates. Besides, we admit offenders from dozens of units.